Recently, there's been tremendous media attention on ISIS and the role of the United States in taking military action against the group. Joining us is Professor Sahar Aziz from Texas A&M University School of Law, a national security expert, here to talk more. Professor Aziz, thank you for being here. Currently, President Obama has ordered strikes in Iraq and also Syria. Is President Obama's actions against ISIS legal under U.S. law?
Well, some legal scholars have argued that the president has constitutional authority under Article 2 and his inherent powers as the president to declare war in anticipatory self-defense. And so in this situation, you have ISIS, who has used very brutal methods and terrorist methods in using force and military use of force itself against innocent civilians, against Iraqi military, against Syrian military and Syrian civilians. And they have, in their rhetoric, been very anti-American. So he could argue that in anticipation of being attacked by ISIS, that he will fight them and use military force.
And what's Congress's role in all of this?
The default in U.S. law is that Congress has the authority to declare war. Therefore, the president could argue that he can rely and go back to 2001 when Congress authorized the use of military force in response to the 9/11 attacks. And that AUMF authorized the president to use military force against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces. ISIS used to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda as far back as 2004, and in fact was affiliated with them for 10 years, until February of this year, when there was a big falling out between Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, and what is now ISIS, over the high death toll of civilians in Syria, and also a dispute as to who controlled the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda. So it depends on how you interpret the AUMF, if those 10 years are enough to allow that AUMF to cover ISIS, notwithstanding the passage of 13 years, or whether the current state of no relationship cuts off the scope of the 2001 AUMF.
What about the argument that the president has authority under the 2002 Congressional Authorization of War?
So the 2002 authorization of use of military force was to allow then President Bush to fight the continuing threat posed by the Iraqi government. That was the government that was controlled by Saddam Hussein. And that government no longer exists. And in fact, Iraq is now an ally, and Iraq is fighting ISIS. So it's a much weaker argument to claim that that AUMF extends to the conflict vis-a-vis ISIS in the Middle East at this moment.
Finally, the U.S. government's taking action right now against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. How does the War Powers Act play into that?
Well, generally, the War Powers Act allows the president to engage in self-defense first and then ask for Congress's permission later, because these types of situations do not lend themselves to waiting for Congress to act, because that takes some time. So the president can use military force, invoking self-defense, and must report it to Congress, and then within 60 days must get permission from Congress or authorization. And if he does not, then he must cease all military actions. Now, President Obama is claiming that either he has inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution, or that this is in fact not a war and not an armed conflict that would fall under the War Powers Act or any other U.S. law for declaring war and use of military force. But in fact, this is a counterterrorism effort, and that the U.S. is involved in a coalition effort, and the U.S. is not engaging in war but simply protecting the nation as standard counterterrorism.
Well, it sounds like there'll be a lot more to talk about in the weeks and months ahead. Professor Sahar Aziz with Texas A&M University, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.